Welcome everyone to Let's Continue to Talk About COBRA. Thank you all for joining us. The Benefits Compliance team will be answering the questions you send through the Q&A today. We will try our best to answer all of your questions, but if for whatever reason we are unable to get to your question today, please follow up with your advisor for further assistance. Today's presentation is being recorded. We will be sharing the recording in the follow-up email and on the NFP website. If there are any portions of this call that you missed, by Monday you'll receive an email with a link to the full recording. The PowerPoint slides used during this presentation will be shared in the same email. At this time, I'll hand it over to Patrick Myers, Vice President and Counsel of Benefits Compliance at NFP, and Kelly Ekman, Vice President of Benefits Compliance at NFP. Kelly, the floor is yours.
All right, thanks, Amber, and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our July Get Wise Wednesday. Let's continue to talk about COBRA. I know this is a topic that many on this call are very familiar with, but I think there are a lot of nuances, whether you outsource COBRA or you handle it in-house. So I think we'll go over a lot of helpful topics for you as Patrick and I walk you through this today. We always like to start with our disclaimer here. So again, the information we're talking about today, it's for informational purposes only. So what we're talking about today is not tax advice, it's not legal advice. If you do have questions of that nature, please take it to your own legal counsel or your own tax advisor. And the information we're talking about is current as of today. So we're going to start today. We're going to go with just a general overview of COBRA, some of the basics. We're going to look at, how employers set the premiums that they're going to charge their employees or qualified beneficiaries. We're going to look at the notices that are required under COBRA. How COBRA and FMLA work together, and then how COBRA works with some other laws like the ACA, Medicare, and how retiree plans come into play. And then we're going to leave you with some takeaways and just general conclusions about COBRA. So Patrick is going to get us started with a general overview of COBRA.
Thank you, Kelly. In our overview, we will discuss who must comply with federal COBRA law, what plans are subject to federal COBRA law, and who benefits from federal COBRA law. And to begin, we must establish that COBRA applies to public and private employers who employ 20 or more common law employees. When we say common law employees, we mean that they hire them for 50% of its typical business day in the previous calendar year. And when we talk about common law employees, we also mean that we mean all employees, not just plan participants. And if you are part of a control group, you must count the employees of all the related employers in the control group. In addition, you need to count part-time employees, although you can do so on a pro rata basis. And you need to count employees outside of the US when you're determining whether or not you are an employer that has 20 or more common law employees for purposes of COBRA. Now, an important thing to keep in mind is if you meet minimum employee requirements mid-year, then employers would be obligated to comply with COBRA on the following calendar year, even if the headcount later drops below 20. So that means that if the threshold changes, you go over the threshold in the middle of the year, that does not mean that you automatically are subject to COBRA. You become subject to COBRA in the following year. And then finally, just to top off that, underscore this, this does not apply to governmental plans or to church plans. Now, at the state level, states also have continuation laws, which we also call mini COBRA laws. And they vary by state in both employer eligibility and duration of continuation. But generally speaking, most state continuation laws apply to employers that have fewer than 20 employees, and they have fully insured plans. That is to say, they have policies, group health policies, that are issued in and regulated by the states in which they operate. But there are some exceptions to this. There are some states that also apply their continuation laws to those larger, fully insured plans, and they provide more generous benefits than what's required under the federal law. For example, in both California and New York, fully insured plans of all sizes are subject to the state law. And really what it does is it extends that COBRA continuation up to 36 months for the medical benefits. Now, in Texas, employees that exhaust federal COBRA are entitled to an additional 6 months of state continuation, even for those events that under federal COBRA terms provide 36 months of coverage. But because these state continuation laws are also state insurance laws, ERISA preempts those laws for self-insured or level-funded plans. And again, to note that some states further limit things like the administrative fee, some prohibit a surcharge completely, have notice requirements, or require a conversion option. The best source of information about a particular state's mini COBRA law will be the insurance carrier. They, of course, would be intimately familiar with all of the continuation law obligations that they would have to fulfill in order to comply with the law. So it's important to work closely with the insurance carrier to understand what obligations you have in the states in which you have employees. Next slide, please. So what plans are subject to COBRA? Under COBRA, a plan, fund, or program that is maintained or established by an employer for the purpose of providing medical care will be a plan that's subject to COBRA. This includes your usual suspects like group health plans, dental and vision plans, but it also includes health FSAs, at least to the extent that they have underspent accounts, HRAs, including ICRAs, employee assistance plans or EAPs, point solution programs, and wellness programs to the extent that they provide medical care would be plans that are subject to COBRA. Typically, HSAs are excluded as long as they aren't a group health plan under ERISA. Long-term care plans, as well as disability, life, AD&D, fixed indemnity, and disease-specific plans are excluded from COBRA. Next slide, please. Now, it's not always easy to determine whether or not a plan is going to be subject to COBRA. Some benefits are more difficult to determine if they are subject to COBRA. Again, like we had mentioned, those EAPs, point solution programs, wellness programs, and disease-specific policies, such as cancer policies, may or may not be subject to COBRA. It really depends on whether or not those programs provide medical care. So it will depend on the actual services that are provided to the program. And if the program provides individualized diagnosis, treatment, or medication services to the individual's specific condition, it's likely medical care and therefore subject to COBRA. If a program provides broad-based information, general well-being, coaching, or education services, it's likely not medical care and so not subject to COBRA. Generally speaking, again, the disability, life, AD&D, and fixed indemnity plans don't provide medical care, so therefore they're not subject to COBRA. But you want to watch out because some AD&D or fixed indemnity plans include additional coverage components that may actually provide medical care, thus making that component of the plan subject to COBRA. So it's a good idea to keep an eye on that to make sure that the plans are subject to COBRA or provide medical care. Next slide, please. So who must be offered COBRA? A group health plan must offer COBRA continuation to qualified beneficiaries. So a qualified beneficiary is anyone that was covered by the plan immediately before a qualifying event. So that could include employees, spouses, and this employee's dependent children, as well as children born to or adopted by a covered employee during COBRA enrollment. It does not extend to domestic partners unless they are tax dependents, nor does it apply to people who are not tax dependents. A domestic partner covered by the plan prior to a COBRA event can enroll in COBRA along with the qualified beneficiary, but the domestic partner could not independently elect COBRA. If a qualified beneficiary is offered a COBRA election, but chooses not to elect COBRA, then they will not be a qualified beneficiary upon the expiration of the election period. Each qualified beneficiary has an independent election right to COBRA, and employers can be more generous when it comes to who they can offer COBRA coverage to, but they would need to get the approval of either the carrier if they're fully insured or their TPA is stop loss carrier if they are self-insured or level funded. Next slide, please. So how long can a COBRA coverage extension last? Well, a qualifying event must cause or will cause a loss of coverage. Qualifying events include the termination of employment, reduction of hours, both of which provide with a coverage duration of 18 months, or divorces or legal separations, death of the covered employee, dependent child ceases to become a dependent, employee becomes entitled to Medicare benefits if doing so results in a loss of eligibility, or an employer's bankruptcy, but that only applies to retirees. Now, divorces, death, and the CCTP dependent, as well as the entitled to Medicare benefits, gives a duration of 36 months versus 18 months. But generally speaking, most of your qualifying events are going to be either your termination of employment or reduction of hours, and those are 18 months. It's important to keep in mind that there's no coverage for termination of employment if the employment was terminated due to gross misconduct. And that is not a term that is defined in COBRA law. That's an employment law concept. So if there's any question about whether or not someone has been terminated due to gross misconduct, then they should consult with their employment law attorney. Now, these durations can be extended if, for instance, if there's a disability involved or there has been multiple qualifying events involved, that could extend the duration of the COBRA coverage. But at the same time, the duration can also be shortened. If, for instance, the qualified beneficiary misses payments, if the employer ceases to operate a plan, or if someone is entitled to Medicare after they've elected COBRA, are all events that could cause the duration to be less than 18 or 36 months as appropriate. Next slide, please. Now, some qualifying events are going to be more difficult to administer and then will depend on specific situations as well as the facts surrounding the situation. For instance, in a divorce context, if an employee does not enroll their spouse at open enrollment because they anticipate divorcing that spouse may still be entitled to a COBRA coverage, even though they were not, in fact, enrolled at open enrollment. So it's difficult to determine in some contexts whether or not the spouse was dropped in open enrollment in anticipation of divorce. So it's important to review the specific facts and circumstances. And if it is determined after that review that, in fact, the spouse was dropped in anticipation of divorce, then the plan will have to offer COBRA as of the date of the divorce, even though the spouse was not enrolled right before the event, as is usual for a qualified beneficiary. Similarly, when someone is entitled to Medicare, that also can trigger some issues, although it is rarely a qualifying event because of Medicare secondary payer rules, which is to say Medicare secondary payer rules prohibit group health plans from making Medicare primary and the group health plan secondary. And so under these rules, group health plans are prohibited from encouraging people from dropping their group health plan in favor of Medicare. So typically, many group health plans do not consider entitlement to Medicare as a loss of coverage. But employers can't terminate coverage just because the employee enrolls in Medicare. So eligibility isn't lost and a COBRA event does not actually occur. The same rule applies, though, to the spouse. If the employee enrolls in Medicare and wants to drop the group health plan, then the spouse will not have a COBRA right. Next slide, please. Now, qualified beneficiaries must be given an opportunity to elect the same coverage that they had just before the qualifying event under each benefit coverage option. COBRA coverage must be identical to the coverage provided to similarly situated beneficiaries under the plan. But coverage can be changed under certain circumstances. Active employees are permitted to change coverage during open enrollment. And so if a COBRA qualified beneficiary has COBRA coverage during open enrollment, they may also have the opportunity to make changes. And a qualified beneficiary with COBRA coverage can add family members under HIPAA special enrollment rights. Now, if a region-specific plan fails to be of value to a qualified beneficiary, that qualified beneficiary does have the ability to choose a plan that does have value to them. And if the employer makes any meaningful modifications to the plan, then a qualified beneficiary has a right to make changes to the plan to reflect those modifications, just like an active employee would. Next slide, please. But what happens if the plans fail to comply with these COBRA rules? Well, the consequences are going to vary based on the type of failure. Examples include the failure to provide the right notices, which we'll talk about later, not offering COBRA for required benefits, not offering open enrollment rights, and incorrectly calculating premiums. Failures can lead to costly litigation, which may include attorney's fees and interest to the prevailing party, as well as statutory penalties of $110 per day for the failure to provide certain notices, such as the election notice. Failure to provide an initial notice could result in COBRA time limits not applying. Failure to provide the election notice, as I mentioned, has that $110 per day per person, as well as a continued COBRA obligation to the person who should have received the election notice. In addition to those, there is potential liability for any medical costs incurred by a participant during a period that a qualified beneficiary should have been offered COBRA coverage but was not. So that is a potential concern if the plan incorrectly informs or represents continued coverage to an ineligible individual. Next slide, please. So now I'll pass this over to Kelly, who will talk more about setting that premium calculation.
All right, thanks, Patrick, for that helpful overview of COBRA. So yeah, now we're gonna talk just at a very high level when it comes to, how are premiums set for someone who is enrolling in COBRA coverage. And so I think most of us are aware that the federal COBRA rules, they allow employers to charge up to 102% of the applicable premium. So you think of it as the 100% of premium and the 2% admin charge. Now, if it is a disability extension, as Patrick mentioned earlier, then they can charge up to 150%. So what is this applicable premium that the employer is going to charge? So this really is the cost of the plan for the period of coverage for similarly situated beneficiaries. So the cost of providing that coverage to that individual. And so when we're looking at this, we're really looking at that total cost of coverage. So it's the employee portion that they normally would have paid as an active employee plus the employer portions. So again, think of it as that total cost to provide someone that coverage that they're enrolled in. COBRA premiums, they must remain fixed for a 12-month period, so they're not something that's going to fluctuate month over month. Now, for fully insured plans, this is pretty easy. Those premiums are set by the carrier. And so it's, the carrier is going to say, for this specific coverage at this, single individual level, this is your cost. Where it gets more confusing is those self-insured plans. And the big thing there is that employers have to use what is called a premium equivalent rate. And employers have to be able to justify that rate that, again, they're sort of making what is the equivalent premium as if we were a fully insured plan. And so there's two different ways that an employer can determine that COBRA premium for the self-insured plan. And these are called the past cost method or an actuarial method. And so the past cost method is going to look at, the cost based on the prior plan year, so the immediately preceding plan year, based on claims costs, administrative expenses, stop loss premiums, or potentially reimbursements. And then they're going to adjust those actual costs by a potential percentage increase or maybe decrease in cost of living. So very small adjustments to, what that amount might be year over year. Now, it's important to understand that you can only use the past cost method if there haven't been significant changes in coverage, or if they didn't have a significant change in the number of employees from the year prior. So sometimes past cost method isn't one that is going to work for a plan. And if it's not going to, then you have to use that actuarial estimate. And that's where you're actually going to engage an actuary to look at, what are the actual costs for that coverage and for the plan. They're going to look at, the demographics of the plan. What are, trends in cost and utilization. So they're going to be trying to estimate what those costs are going to be looked at, and then provide that actuarial value for what the estimated cost of providing that coverage will be. So those are the two ways that a self-insured plan would figure out what that applicable premium is. And so again, when we think about self-insured plans, Patrick mentioned earlier, HRAs, ICRAs, point solutions, all those are considered self-insured plans. And so employers have to use these methods to set that premium. So we're always going to recommend working with an actuary to set those premiums. And then obviously, I think most of us are aware, again, you have to allow someone to pay on a monthly basis. You can't ask a beneficiary to, pay up front for 12 months of COBRA. That'd likely be very cost prohibitive. This is just a nice little graphic basically talking about what we said, the various ways that premiums can be set. And then down here, we do have a note about credit card fees. Again, there's always been a little bit of a gray area as far as, ways to allow someone to pay for coverage. Obviously, making sure that you don't only require that these costs are paid by credit card, because there can be, fees associated with it. So making sure there are ways that someone can pay, via check or electronic funds transfer, that kind of thing. And so now we're going to talk about notices. And Patrick talked earlier too about some of the consequences of not providing notices. So we'll drill down a little bit into, what are some of these notices and why are they important? And so here's just a little graphic of some of the notices that we're going to touch on. And so, one of the big ones here is that initial notice. And so again, as Patrick said earlier, group health plans have to provide the notice to employees and spouses once they become covered by a COBRA eligible benefit. Okay, and so it's basically going to inform them, here are what your rights are under COBRA at the time that you are entering the plan. So it's going to give the basics about, when you may be eligible for COBRA, what type of events trigger COBRA, the timelines that you have to follow. Again, we all know that's pretty important to make sure that, someone is following those COBRA timelines so that they can get the coverage if they need it. The big thing to remember here is that you only want to give this initial notice to participants who are actually covered under those plans, right? So these are the employees who are actually enrolled in these benefits. So we generally don't recommend including it in enrollment packets or benefit guides, because then it is actually going to employees who are not actually COBRA eligible. They may not be enrolled in a COBRA eligible benefit. One of the important things here is the timing. So making sure that covered employees and spouses, they need to receive that initial notice within 90 days of coverage. And in bold here, it's always important to remember that if the spouse enrolls in the COBRA eligible coverage at a later date than the employee, they must be provided their own separate notice. And I think this gets missed a lot. So if I enroll as a new hire into medical and I only enroll myself, I will receive that COBRA notice based on my enrollment. Now, if I enroll my spouse, let's say at open enrollment, that spouse then needs to receive their own COBRA initial notice because they were not enrolled in the COBRA benefit when I first enrolled, but they now are enrolled as of, the new plan you're starting from open enrollment. So I think this gets missed a lot. So make sure that, you're talking to your COBRA vendors to make sure that there is a process in place to capture a spouse who enrolls at a later date. It's important to note here too, these notices are not required to be provided to covered children. So we're just looking at the employee or their spouse. If someone's enrolled in multiple plans, typically it's okay to provide one initial notice as long as it is covering all of the applicable plans. And so, while there aren't penalties if you don't supply this initial notice, as Patrick mentioned earlier, how are you going to enforce deadlines if you didn't tell someone about them, right? So that's why it's important to make sure that these notices are going out so that if you need to enforce it later, you can show that. Now, we do always say, if an employer isn't sure that the initial notice has been provided, you may want to engage with your vendor and redistribute it to all covered employees and spouses. Again, not that blanket notice in open enrollment, but actually sending that out to everyone. And here's just a graphic about the things that are included in that initial notice. Again, pretty standard. You can find model notices online. We have a link here. Then obviously, if you are engaging a vendor, they're going to have that as well. So then the next, important notice here is the election notice. So again, the election notice, it's going to go to those qualified beneficiaries. It's going to make sure that they understand what are the rules under COBRA. Are there limits to their rights? When the employee and spouse are at the same address, it's going to actually specifically say it's to the covered employee and spouse. So when we think about the election notice, we think about, the timing. When do these need to go? The first step is the plan administrator needs to be notified when a qualifying event occurs. So let's say someone, terminates employment, a very common example. So the deadline to get these notices out, it is to get it to that qualified beneficiary within 14 days after the plan administrator has been notified. Now, I think most of us think about this in a more practical stance of knowing a deadline is 44 days. So having 30 days to notify the administrator and 14 days to notify the employee if the employer and the plan administrator are the same. And that's pretty typical for that to happen. But so usually we're looking at 44 days. But as we have in our practical tip here, you want to get this out to employees or former employees as quickly as possible. Because if somebody is choosing to enroll in COBRA, they likely need that coverage. And so trying to avoid a gap in coverage is really important. A few helpful hints at the bottom here. So again, the notice is furnished. So generally using that date that it is mailed. Employers need to make sure that you're taking steps to make sure that it is actually received by those specific parties. And then really looking at, how are these notices being delivered? So the best practice here is making sure that you do have a written policy that explains how you're going to distribute those notices. Make sure that you or the vendor that you're using are maintaining copies and records of the notices that are being sent out. That way, if you need to prove that those were sent out, you can do so. So having some sort of a log, I think, is really helpful for tracking purposes. And here's this little graphic looking at, what is included in that election notice. And again, you can look at model notices if needed as well. And so a couple more notices that, can come out through the life cycle of an employee or former employee on COBRA. So the notice of unavailability. So there can be those times, as Patrick mentioned earlier, that COBRA is not available for someone. They would need to get a notice that's explaining that to them. For one of those situations where someone is experiencing a second COBRA qualifying event and their coverage is extended, there's going to be an extension notice that's going to go out. Make sure that if you have employees who are either eligible for COBRA or are definitely enrolled in COBRA, make sure they're getting open enrollment packets. They need to get the same materials as active employees because they need to make those decisions, at the end of your plan year, just like your active employees do. And then finally, the notice of early termination. Again, if you have a beneficiary who is experiencing one of those situations where coverage is going to terminate earlier, again, example here, non-payment of premiums, they need to be receiving this notice of early termination. And so how can you distribute? Again, mail, hand delivery, or electronic. Mail is typically the best practice. So using first class mail is usually preferred. You want to document that. Hand delivery, sometimes employers will do that. If you do that, you do want to make sure that you're getting a signature of receipt by that person. Don't just hand it to them and walk off. And then electronic distribution is tough because the DOL does have a safe harbor where employers can distribute notices electronically. However, one of the key things there is that the person has work-related computer access as an integral part of their job. So if they're no longer your employee, they don't have work-related computer access as part of their job. So electronic delivery of these notices is going to be difficult. So typically, using the mail and making sure that you are documenting it is the way to go. All right, now Patrick's going to talk through COBRA and FMLA for us.
Thank you, Kelly. COBRA and FMLA interact in interesting ways, in ways that aren't necessarily intuitive. So we wanted to spend a few minutes going over how those two laws interact. And before we get started on that actual interaction, let's go over for a moment what FMLA is and what it requires. The statute requires private employers that have 50 or more employees, as well as governments and schools of any size, to provide up to 12 weeks of unpaid job-protected leave per year when the employer determines that the reason for the leave is a qualifying reason under FMLA. Reasons such as, the birth of a child or a serious health condition of either the employee or the employee's family member and the like. And an eligible employee under FMLA isn't going to be an employee that has been working for 12 months for the employer or has given 1,250 hours of service in the last 12 months and works within 75 miles of 49 other employees. Next slide, please. And the key concept here for our purposes is that even though that leave is going to be unpaid, employers must maintain group health plan benefits for an employee on FMLA leave on the same terms as if the employee had continued work. Now, that said, even though the employer must maintain those benefits, the employee is still on the hook for their share of the premiums, even if they're on unpaid leave under FMLA. So the rules do allow employees to drop coverage when they start FMLA leave so that they won't have to pay for those premiums. But the law does not consider that to be a loss of eligibility, at least not for COBRA purposes. When an employee returns from FMLA leave, the group health coverage must be restored to them. And if an employee doesn't return from FMLA leave, the employer must then determine their rights to continue group coverage under COBRA. But the important thing to remember here is that taking the FMLA leave is not by itself a COBRA qualifying event, even if the person who is on the leave has opted not to continue their coverage while on FMLA leave. Next slide, please. So a qualifying event occurs when we're talking about FMLA and COBRA. The qualifying event actually occurs when the employee was covered on the day before the start of FMLA, but does not return to employment at the end of the FMLA leave, and the employee would, in absence of COBRA, lose coverage under the plan before the end of the maximum coverage period. Another way of saying that is this: if the plan would extend eligibility while on leave, even after a certain point when someone is no longer actively at work, then the employer must take that into account when determining when the person has actually lost coverage. So even though they had a FMLA leave and they did not return at the end of FMLA leave, they may still be eligible for coverage under the terms of the plan, and you have to take that into account. But once that's exhausted, the employer must follow plan document eligibility terms to determine the loss of coverage date. So they have to determine, when exactly under the terms of the plan the person has actually lost coverage. If the employee does not return in a timely manner, the COBRA triggering date will be the last day of the leave. If coverage is lost at a later date and the plan provides for the extension, then the maximum coverage period is the measurement from the date when the coverage is lost. So the fact that they may not return from FMLA leave is not by itself the date that starts the COBRA obligations. You also have to take into account any extensions that would be provided under the plan terms for any additional eligibility while a person is on leave. And when that is exhausted, that's when the COBRA obligations really begin. Next slide, please. Now, if the employee fails to pay the premium while on FMLA, that is, they had opted not to drop the coverage, so they're on the hook for paying their portion of the premium, but they failed to do so, then what happens when they fail to do that and then also fail to return from the leave? Now, an important concept here is that a lapse in coverage during FMLA leave is not relevant to whether or not they've lost eligibility while on FMLA leave. The plan may continue coverage that has already been lost. The employer can recover premium amounts whether or not the employee returns to work after FMLA leave. And coverage cannot be conditioned upon reimbursement by the employee for coverage received during the FMLA leave. So it's still the concept that the eligibility isn't really lost while the FMLA is going on kind of applies here as well. So that's something to keep in mind. Now, another thing to keep in mind is that there are some state workers' compensation laws that will continue health plan coverage for an employee who is unable to work due to on-the-job injuries. So that is another factor to take into account when you are concerned with whether or not someone who would be on leave would be eligible for or become a qualified beneficiary for COBRA coverage. Next slide, please. So we focused specifically on COBRA and FMLA, but there are other laws that might actually be at play too. And so I'm going to pass this back over to Kelly to talk more about that.
All right, thanks, Patrick. So we're going to talk about COBRA's interaction with some other laws. I will start by saying some of this can get pretty complex. So don't feel bad if you don't quite get it this first time. I definitely recommend taking a look back at the slides when you get it or the recording, because these can be some tricky concepts that we're going to kind of talk through at a very high level here. So the first one we're going to talk through is interaction between COBRA and the ACA, and specifically when we're talking about those look-back measurement periods. So the way that eligibility is determined under the ACA's employer mandate. So first we want to say, well, what are these look-back measurement periods? So again, if employers have part-time or variable hour employees, many of those employers will use look-back measurement periods. So they're looking at the number of hours that an employee works, generally over a 12-month period in the past, to then determine whether that person is considered a full-time equivalent employee, meaning they averaged 30 hours or more per week. And that's the standard that the ACA sets for saying someone should be eligible for medical coverage. And so then if an employer is using this look-back period, once that full-time status is determined, the employee is generally locked into that status as being eligible for the entire stability period. And so the stability period in this case, it's going to be your plan year. So if I'm determined to be full-time based on the look back, then for my next plan year, so let's say January through December, I'm going to be considered full-time in the eyes of the ACA. So we want to look at, well, what happens if someone has a reduction of hours, or if they, change from full-time to part-time? Do they just get offered COBRA right away, or do we have to treat them a little bit differently? And so this is where it gets a little tricky. So in this case, when an employee is going to have a reduction of hours, or, they're otherwise switching, I was a full-time employee, now I'm switching to a part-time job. If I am in that stability period, so I'm locked into my status as full-time eligible, that's locked in for the plan year. So that means even though, I had been working full-time hours, now I'm working part-time hours, I'm going to retain that eligibility for coverage through the end of the plan year. So employers generally are not going to, or shouldn't be dropping someone from medical coverage just because they switch from full-time to part-time. So you don't just say, oh, you're part-time as of July 1st, you're no longer eligible for your medical coverage, we're going to give you COBRA. You want to pump the brakes before you do that, okay? Because again, that person is typically going to be locked into that full-time status for that whole stability period, or that whole plan year. Now, there is kind of a quirky little exception that exists. So if I have someone They were hired in as a full-time job, and I've been continually offered medical coverage since I was hired. Now I'm switching to a part-time job. So my life has changed. I want to move from full-time to part-time. I'm having this status change. In that situation, you may be able to move that employee to the monthly measurement method. So measuring them, instead of looking at, the hours someone worked historically for a 12-month period, now you're just looking at how many hours are they working each month to determine if they are offered coverage or not. Now, again, you still can't do that right away. You have to wait. So if I switch from full-time to part-time, that switch cannot occur until the first day of the 4th month following that status change. So if I change to part-time as of July 1, we've still got to wait 3 more months where I'm considered to be eligible for coverage before the employer can switch me potentially to monthly measurement. And then once I am switched to monthly measurement, then if I'm not going to be averaging the 30 hours a week or that 130 hours per month, I would no longer be eligible for the medical coverage for that month. And then once that eligibility is lost, then I'm going to be offered COBRA. So the big takeaway here is really just to understand, just because you have someone switch from full-time to part-time, they likely are not losing coverage right away if you are subject to the employer mandate. And then they're not going to be offered COBRA right away because they're not losing coverage right away. So I always tell people kind of, pump the brakes a little bit if you do have employees who are experiencing those status changes. And so just a little visual here, again, as I kind of described. So if I have that full-time employee, they're full-time for the stability period or that plan year, but then they're failing to average. So we've had a change, I'm no longer working 30 hours per week during that next look back measurement period. Okay, so I've been full-time for a long time, then I've been dropping my hours, and now this next time that they're analyzing me over a 12-month period, I'm no longer averaging 30 hours per week. I'm still going to be able to stay on the plan for the rest of the year, potentially. So my COBRA event is not going to occur until that plan year has ended, because I was locked into full-time. If you weren't using that little quirky little exception we mentioned before, I'm going to be locked into full-time status for this whole stability period. Once that coverage ends, let's say, on 12/31, that's when my COBRA event is going to occur, because I'm no longer eligible for coverage next month. And as we mentioned, again, if you're using that little exception where I'm moving someone from the look back measurement method, then after 3 months, I'm moving them to a monthly measurement, that's where it gets more complicated, because now my loss of eligibility is not at the end of the plan year, it's at the end of that, potentially at the end of that 3rd month. But again, it's going to depend on, if I'm losing eligibility right away, or if I'm back up to, averaging 30 hours or more per week. So again, it's very complicated. I just like people to understand, kind of pump the brakes with those changes. Work with your ACA reporting vendor. They should have tracking modules, or, reach out to your consultants at NFP to kind of help guide you through how to handle these changes in status. The next, also very complicated one we're going to look at is the interaction between COBRA and Medicare. And so we're going to look at, we have the graphic here saying it's going to depend on when that employee enrolls in Medicare. So if the employee enrolls in Medicare before they experience their COBRA event, you're still going to offer them COBRA just like normal. If they'd enrolled in Medicare after they're on COBRA, so let's say I retire at 64 and a half, so I'm not yet on Medicare, so I enroll in COBRA for 6 months. Then I enroll in Medicare. There may be situations where the employer can actually terminate that COBRA coverage early. Now, again, only if the plan allows it. You have to apply it consistently to all employees. And again, we're just talking about that employee or that individual, not the spouse or children. So when that employee enrolls in Medicare is going to be really important as to how COBRA is offered as it relates to Medicare. Now, what about those spouse or children? How do these rules affect them? So again, we're looking at, it's still going to be based on when did that employee enroll in Medicare, and how it's going to affect the spouse or children. So if I, the employee, enrolled in Medicare before I experience a COBRA qualifying event, again, we're going to offer COBRA, but my spouse or my child who's being offered COBRA, they're going to get 36 months of COBRA, but it's going to be measured from my date of Medicare enrollment. So let's say I enroll in Medicare 6 months before I retire. And then, so I've been on Medicare for 6 months, but I also stayed on the group health plan because I cover my spouse or my children. Once I decide to retire, and then we're going to have a termination and we're going to offer COBRA, my spouse or my children are going to get COBRA for 36 months minus those 6 months between when I enrolled in Medicare and when I terminated. So they essentially would be offered 30 months of COBRA. So it's going to be based on that date. Now, this comes up a lot too. What if I enrolled in Medicare after COBRA? So again, I retired at 64 and a half. So I was offered COBRA, my spouse, my kids were offered COBRA. If I then enroll in Medicare at 65, it is not a secondary qualifying event. We get asked this a lot. So just because, the former employee enrolled in Medicare after termination, it does not give that spouse or children an extra 18 months of COBRA. So the only time Medicare is going to give more than the 18 months is if the employee was enrolled in Medicare before experiencing that termination of employment. So again, this one comes up quite a lot, but I think this graphic is helpful just as a quick look at, how these apply. And then we have retiree coverage. And, we always like to say that retiree coverage can be a very litigious area. So if you're an employer that offers retiree coverage, please work with your benefits counsel. They can counsel you specifically on your plan design. So we'll give a few highlights here, but it's very important that you are working with them for a compliant plan design. So when we're looking at retiree coverage, again, the basics here, retirement is going to be a COBRA qualifying event, just the same as any other job termination would be, right? Retirement, job termination, same thing. They're going to offer coverage the same way as somebody getting fired, let's say. Again, I had my disclaimer here about making sure that you are working with counsel, making sure that you have everything documented clearly and that you are communicating it to participants. You always want to make sure that if there are any surviving spouse or surviving child rules, those are included in that documentation, making sure that there's a coordination with Medicare, that kind of thing. But we're going to talk about how does COBRA come into play. So how or when COBRA is offered, it's going to depend on that retiree plan design. And so it's going to depend on whether it's known as being identical to the active plan or as an alternative to COBRA. And we'll talk through these on the next slide. So the first one here. So if that retiree coverage is identical to the active plan. And so what that means is that retirees are staying on that same active plan. Or so the same plan as the active employees, they're paying the same cost. That means the employer is paying those same contributions. They're subsidizing it just like they do for active employees. The coverage levels are exactly the same. Because the coverage continues exactly the same, no COBRA event exists at that time. Now, if a retiree waives coverage, no COBRA election is needed, even when their retiree coverage that they could have otherwise chosen has expired. But what happens when this identical coverage ends? So in part, it's going to depend on how long did that identical coverage last. So if it equals or exceeds the COBRA maximum, so we're going to have 18 months, then COBRA is not going to be needed even at the end of that identical retiree coverage. But let's say this identical retiree coverage is less than the COBRA max. In that case, someone is going to be offered COBRA, but it's only going to be for the remaining amount of the COBRA max. So in our example here, let's say as the retiree, you allow them 12 months of identical coverage. So we think about, normal termination, you get offered 18 months of COBRA. We then subtract the 12 months of that active retiree coverage, and then that leaves us with a balance of 6 months. So you would still offer them 6 months of COBRA. Now we have the reminder here at the bottom, what if the plan is identical, but the cost is different? Is that still considered identical to the active plan? And so the answer is no, there's a cost difference. And so it is not identical, and therefore it's not going to fall under these rules. So then we're looking at, okay, well, if it's not identical, this retiree plan is going to be an alternative to COBRA. And so again, it's going to be an alternative if it's different from the active employee coverage or the active employee cost. Again, the big thing here to remember is that the retirees, they're going to retain the right to elect COBRA at retirement. So that means they still need to receive the offer of COBRA on the active plan, just like any other terminating employee would. And basically, they're then going to choose between regular COBRA or this alternative retiree coverage. Typically, employers, again, will require the retirees to waive their rights to COBRA in exchange for taking this alternative coverage. And again, for spouses and dependents, in many cases, they're going to experience, a COBRA event if they're losing this alternative coverage due to your standard COBRA events, death of the retiree, getting divorced. But as we talked about earlier, sometimes you can actually design these plans a little bit differently so they're not going to trigger those COBRA events. But that's why working with your benefits counsel on the plan design is so important, so that you can potentially plan for some of those situations. And then finally, what's COBRA look like in the M&A context? So those mergers and acquisitions. Again, another one where we're always going to tell employers, if you are engaging in a transaction like this, make sure that you're working with your counsel and make sure that you're talking about this, as early in the process as you can. Generally, COBRA obligations are going to default to the seller, but the parties in the transaction can actually negotiate. So you can't just assume that it's going to go to the seller. There can be ways where, a buyer could potentially take on that obligation. And so, within the M&A context, we have our COBRA qualified beneficiaries. They can be known as M&A qualified beneficiaries. So these are people who are already on COBRA under the seller's plan, or someone whose employment is terminating as a result of that sale. Sometimes it's going to depend on whether or not that seller is maintaining a group health plan. So was the seller part of a controlled group and another division or company still offers a plan, or whether the seller ceases to exist. And then depending on stock transactions or asset sales, those are also going to determine the way that COBRA is handled. So again, really just making sure that this is, kind of at the top of your mind. And so that if you are engaging in one of these transactions, you are working through these ahead of time to make sure that you are meeting your obligations. All right, and then Patrick's going to take us through some final takeaways and reminders today.
Thanks, Kelly. We've covered a lot of ground today, and it's easy to get lost in the weeds on this subject, but here are some takeaways, some high-level takeaways that hopefully you can take with you after we're done here. First, make sure that coverage is offered to COBRA qualified beneficiaries is the same as the coverage immediately before the qualifying event. Don't forget to provide the covered spouse with the COBRA initial notice. Check state continuation laws for additional obligations. And if using the look-back measurement method, be sure that active employees remain covered during the entire stability period, even if they incur a reduction of hours that causes them to lose eligibility and triggers a loss of coverage under the plan. Next slide, please. So here's some compliance reminders. Confirm that COBRA is offered on all plans providing medical care. Confirm that those initial notices are sent at the right time to the right people and via an acceptable method. Confirm election notices are sent at the right time to the right people and via an acceptable method. Confirm COBRA premiums are calculated and charged correctly for each fixed 12-month determination period. Confirm the same special enrollment and open enrollment rights are offered to COBRA participants as active employees. Confirm COBRA participants receive required group health plan notices. Confirm COBRA compliance along with any retiree coverage offers, and review COBRA obligations ahead of any mergers or acquisitions. And we have a great publication, is the COBRA, a guide for employers, that covers much of things we cover today in greater detail. So please be sure to ask for a copy of that from your consultant. Next slide, please. So even when COBRA administration is outsourced, remember that employers as plan administrators have direct responsibility for ongoing COBRA compliance. So it's a good idea to routinely review COBRA vendor agreements and procedures to confirm that all outsourced services satisfy compliance requirements. So also keep in mind that employee lawsuits seeking to enforce COBRA rights are common. If a COBRA failure is discovered, be sure to consult with your attorney as soon as possible. Next slide. And that's it for the day. Any questions?
Yes, thank you, Patrick. Yeah, it looks like we had quite a few questions coming in. So hopefully those got answered well. And as Patrick mentioned, we have our newly revised COBRA publication, which is a great resource. So definitely recommend that if you're interested in that, make sure that you are requesting a copy of it from your consultant or advisor, because it can really answer a lot of the questions, and really a lot of the questions or the topics that we covered today actually align directly with that publication. So we definitely recommend taking a look at that, and it can help answer quite a few of your questions there as well. So otherwise, thank you all for joining today, and I will let Amber take us out.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Kelly and Patrick, for sharing your valuable time and expertise with us today. To reiterate, today's presentation was recorded. We will be sharing the recording in the follow-up email and on the NFP website. If there are any portions of this call that you missed, by Monday, you'll receive an email with a link to the full recording. The PowerPoint slides used during this presentation will be shared in the same email. At the end of this call, a survey will populate in a new window. Please take a brief moment to complete the survey, as it lets us know what topics are important to our listeners and helps make our education program as current and relevant as possible. That concludes our webinar for today. Thank you everyone for joining us, and have a great day.